Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and good evening. And for those who are still looking for a chair, at Beth Israel, we are SRO, standing room only. But we are bringing more chairs and probably another table, so just be patient. But we're delighted. There's some chairs up here, if you don't mind sitting in the front of the room, right here. We won't call on you. But we really want to have a place for everybody to enjoy the evening. Really look around in the front and around there. Any empty chair is for you. So thank you for coming tonight to worship and welcome Shabbat, and of course to welcome our distinguished guest, scholar and author, Rabbi Daniel Gordis. For many of you, this is not your first time learning with Rabbi Gordis, but if it is your first time, it's really a treat, a gift, and we are delighted that we are together for the weekend. So there's a lot to talk about, many questions that we'll ask, and I know that there are cards and pencils on your table, so if there is a question that you want to be sure is asked, you can jot it down. David Scott and others will be collecting them, and he'll bring them up to me so we can address them this evening. So in the prophets we read, Amos said, "I am not a prophet, nor am I the son of a prophet." And so we shouldn't behave like prophets, but we are not prohibited from imagining the future based on the circumstances that exist on the ground. And we're all a part of the conversation. You can't tell a Jewish person not to participate in the conversation or to ask a question or divulge an opinion or even two. But Daniel, hope you don't mind if I call you Daniel. You're not a prophet, but you're a brilliant scholar and a very astute observer of conditions. What should we continue to hope for, and what needs to change in order for that hope to manifest itself in something that we can all imagine together?
First of all, I want to thank you again for the invitation to be here this weekend. And to reiterate what everybody here knows, but I think it's really important to say, which is that this congregation is having a weekend devoted to Israel because of the leadership that you bring and the vision that you bring. So that's no small thing, and it needs to be acknowledged, and I'm delighted and honored to be able to do so. Are we talking the immediate stuff or the long-term stuff?
Well, I think for some of us it's short term,
Okay.
because as you said tonight, the existential threat is upon us. But I think for many of us, as we commented earlier, you grew up in America, but for all of us who are Americans, we like neat and tidy conclusions. Where are we going? Is there some hope that we can really, in the long term, imagine?
That's a very important question. It's also obviously equally germane to America. Neat and tidy doesn't really fit any part of human life. It doesn't fit any countries. It doesn't fit marriage. It doesn't fit raising children. Neat and tidy is for books or fairy tales. In the short run in Israel, and there's obviously, I'm sure we'll talk about it more, I think what we have to worry about is the immediate term. The next, 4, 6, 8 weeks, I think are potentially very explosive. But what I really do feel very optimistic about is what I would call the explosion of love of the country that we have seen in these protesters who everybody expected to say, oh, I don't really like that, but I'm too busy, going public to be worried about that. They're going public, but they're out in public. So I think that there's an explosion of love and an embrace of a young generation wanting to help shape the next generation of Israel. I think that in the very, very short run, how Bibi tries to put this to bed or to maybe whittle it down and get it through, how he survives. He's currently plummeting in the polls. He has 34 seats in the Knesset. In the middle of Passover, the poll said that he would get 20 seats if elections were held now. He's in a horrible spot. And I will say very seriously, this is not the Bibi of old. Whether you loved him or hated him is irrelevant. He was a master. He was a master politician and a puppeteer of the Knesset and his officers and his ministers. he's completely lost control, whether that's because something's wrong or I don't know. But so in the short run, I think we have to worry about potential violence. We have to worry about all sorts of things. But in the longer run, I think what we're seeing is that there's a whole generation of Israelis who care deeply. And ironically, both sides of this, and there's actually more than two sides, and it's really super important to try to stay away from the terms left and right. It's not about left and right. It's left, center, and a good chunk of the right versus a slice of the right that is largely Mizrahi and feels quite rightly that they have been mistreated for a very long time. That's in the short run. In the long run, look, ask my children. If they said that, talk to us about optimism, they would be on the floor howling. He could talk to you about a lot of things they would say, but optimism is not one of them. But I am actually very optimistic because I think what we've created is so unbelievable with all of its faults that it's just hard for me to imagine that Israelis are going to let it slip through their fingers. It's just, and I'm thrilled by these protests, which I've been going to also. We go to the one in Jerusalem, the big ones in Tel Aviv, but they're unbelievable. The love. So I'm very optimistic in the long run that we're going to see this as a beginning of a really important conversation about what kind of country we should be.
Fantastic. Thank you for responding to that question with optimism about the current state of affairs. You mentioned Mizrahi. We've talked before about those who are the children and grandchildren of the founders of Israel. Can you explain a little bit more about this Mizrahi constituency that we're not as familiar with? In fact, even those that we spoke about earlier regarding those who were taken out of Gaza in 2005 against their will and have some lingering feelings about what they want their government to do for them and with them for the sake of the future. Because it isn't just left or right, it's very complicated and many factions.
So let's start with the Mizrahim. The Mizrahim is a term that refers to Jews of the Levant, meaning Jews who came from Arab countries or Muslim countries. So North Africa, Yemen, Iraq, and Iran. Now, in the story that you and I tell about Israel, right, the story that we tell about Israel always starts in Europe. Starts with a guy named Theodor Herzl, posing over the bridge with his beard, and then it goes to Chaim Nachman Bialik, and then it goes to Zev Jabotinsky and Achad Ha'am, and then a whole bunch of other people, and then Golda Meir is going to enter the picture from America and then come to Palestine. We tell a story that is entirely Europe-centric. The majority of Israel's Jews today are from the Levant. We are a minority, you and I. If you and I walk down Ben Yehuda Street, we're a minority. And the fact that everybody here is surprised about that, or many of you I heard okay, that's fine, by the way, that's great. But the fact that you're surprised about it would just, if the Mizrahim were here, they would say, you see, you don't even know that we're the majority. Okay, now, but just to make it more complicated, in 1935 there were 17 million Jews in the world. We, of course, have not gotten back to that even in 70-something years after the war. Right, we're not anywhere near there. But there were 17 million Jews in the world in 1935. 1 million of them were Mizrahim. Like 6%, whatever the number that is. There's some statisticians in the room I know because I'm being hosted by one. So I don't know exactly what that number is, but it was small. And therefore, you really, on a certain level, couldn't blame Ben-Gurion for thinking that they were a marginal phenomenon because A, demographically they were, and B, he'd never met one. So he but the world has changed a lot. And they feel that they've been treated as second-class citizens, and they are right. In the early days, they were excluded. I mean, it was really good old-fashioned, what happens in lots of countries, and we did it just as well as anybody else, sadly. There's another thing going on, too, though. Those European founders of the state, and I'm going to say this way, it's going to sound confusing, but I mean it exactly as I'm going to say it. They thought that Zionism would save the Jewish people from the Jewish religion. Okay? The Jewish religion was making the Jew weak, passive, afraid, sitting in yeshiva all day long, going like that, and when the Cossacks came, there was nothing you could do. And Zionism, I said a little bit earlier, is even about making a new Jew. But the new Jew that the founders of Israel had in mind was a highly, highly secular Jew. And unlike American Jewish secularism, which was a gradual process of erosion over the generations, this was a slamming of the door. Many of Israel's early leaders were raised in Orthodox homes in Eastern Europe and then slammed the door and whatever. So just think about the picture that you've all seen of David Ben-Gurion reading the Declaration of Independence in 1948. He's not wearing kippah, and he didn't forget it at home. Right? Now here's the irony. A foreign head of state comes, Donald Trump or Barack Obama, it doesn't matter. We make them go to Yad Vashem, and we make them put on a kippah, which I think is the most ludicrous thing in the world, but maybe not the most ludicrous thing in the world, but it's pretty ludicrous. It's ridiculous. I don't need Barack Obama or Donald Trump to wear kippot. I really don't. But we do that, and David Ben-Gurion himself didn't even do that. You have to understand the fury in their secularism. Now, the Mizrahim, those Jews from the Levant, North Africa, whatever, they came en masse after the state was founded. The state was founded, the Arab states declared war on Israel. The Arab world said the Arab world is at war with the Jewish state. And then all of a sudden, the Jews in Algeria, Morocco, and then all the way through couldn't really stay. And I don't know what's on my suit, but it's not good. Something dropped. I guess I was too near the food table. But in any event, the Mizrahim never bought into this secularism thing. And I want to come back to how complicated they are for us as liberal American Jews also. But they are much more instinctively traditional. Not necessarily punctiliously observant, but they have a very warm place in their heart for observance. And they believe, and I think that they're right, that a state that does not have a good chunk of admiration for and engagement with the Jewish religious tradition. I'm not saying a halachic state, everybody's got to be religious, but that it's got to be in the ether, so to speak. They say then it's just a Hebrew-speaking Belgium. And there's really no reason to die for a Hebrew-speaking Belgium. Really isn't, and they're not wrong. So what's going on here is partly civil rights, partly a battle about what kind of Judaism is really going to save the Jewish people, and they say that the old version did. And I just want to say something about us to make it a little more complicated, because I think if we can make everything here more complicated, we'll have succeeded. Absolutely. No, I mean that 100%. I mean that 100%.
And he's leaving town to leave us to sort it out.
Right, exactly. I'm getting out of here on Sunday. I'm flying back to Israel to go for a very emotionally simple Yom HaAtzmaut. But here's the thing about civil rights. Civil rights is not, I want those people to have all the rights coming to them so they can vote and live exactly the way I do. That's not civil rights. Now, the Mizrahi world is very instinctively traditional. There are people that work at Shalem with me at the college that I work at. There's a young woman, in her, I guess now she's in her 40s, but when she was in her 30s and having kids, I would occasionally get invited to the various, the bris or the this or the that, and she's Mizrahi. She's not observant in any meaningful way at all. But my God, when they had their baby things, I mean, it was like you were in Iraq with the Baba Sali or whoever. I mean, it was the real deal. And it wasn't that they were faking anything. There are moments in life, they believe, that you dig deep into the well of tradition with no worries about whether that's intellectually consistent. It's emotionally consistent. At pivotal moments in my life, I want tradition to wash over me and my family. Now, that's all well and good. The Mizrahi world has made tremendous advances. Women in the Mizrahi world are as employed as the men. They are lawyers, they are surgeons, they're everything. They're in the Knesset. I mean, they've made a tremendous amount of progress. The Mizrahi world is not interested in egalitarianism, liberal Judaism, I say the following as a conservative rabbi, conservative Judaism or Reform Judaism. They're not interested. It's not out of hatred or dislike. We like what we do. We like what we do. And for you and me, the struggle is going to be to recognize that we have to take great pride in the strides that they have made in Israeli society, economically, culturally, and whatever, without saying, okay, now we want you to embrace my Jewish way of life, because they're not gonna. They have to accept it. They have to honor it, but we don't have to make it theirs. And we're gonna struggle, all of us who are liberal American Jews, to understand that the demographic hill that we're climbing is only gonna get steeper. They're growing, they're becoming a larger majority than they already are, and they're very instinctively traditional. Does that mean that in 75 years, there's not gonna be a different role for women in their religious life? I'm sure there will be, but it's gonna be much slower and much more gradual than we have done it. And if we were to push back and say why, one of the things that they would say is, because we don't want to face all the demographic and identity challenges that you're facing. We want to do it much more slowly. So this is all real complicated, but they see this as they won the election. They did. And they see this as their moment to cut back on the power of the courts, which we can talk about down the road.
Well, that's exactly where we want to go. I know that we hear in the headlines and in the articles more and more about judicial reform, and it's very easy to be confounded by the notion and the idea, but I think it really hinges on this idea. They won the election, and this is their moment to accomplish something. We could be here all weekend talking about judicial reform. What is essential that we should understand about what's really happening and what is at stake?
The Supreme Court is seen by many Israelis as the last bastion of Ashkenazi, secular, elitist patronizing. And I told you this earlier today, but I'll just repeat it. I learned something from this about 3 weeks ago reading the paper on a Shabbat. The Shabbat before Pesach, when we were still in Jerusalem, I read an op-ed in one of the papers by this Yoel Ben-Nun guy we were just talking about earlier. And he said the following, and again, I'm not asking you to agree with his politics. I just want you to hear his soul. Okay, that's, I think, what we need to do when we're in these passionate disagreements. We don't have to agree, but we have to hear the pain and the angst of the people with whom we disagree. Okay? Yoel Ben-Nun, who's a very well-known Orthodox rabbi, a phenomenal Bible teacher, whatever, writes something about 3-4 weeks ago. He says the following, I'll do it real quick. He says, I actually didn't vote for this government, which actually shocked me, but okay. He said, I didn't vote for this government. And he said, I actually know virtually nobody who has a significant position in this government. And I know most of the members of the Supreme Court, and I consider many of them good friends. And I hate the Supreme Court. Now, why? Here's his example. Again, just let the feeling speak to you. He said in 2005, when Israel did the disengagement, 8,000 Jews were pulled out of their homes.
In Gaza.
In Gaza. The disengagement from Gaza under Ariel Sharon, who tragically had a stroke right after he did it, so we don't actually know what his plan would have been had he encountered what we've subsequently encountered. If he had a plan, what he would have done, hard to know. Impossible to know. Anyway, these people did not want to leave, obviously. They had gone to Gaza, and I'm going to also try to get you to understand, I know settler is a very laden term, okay? It's not a laden term, by the way, if it's a horse and buggy heading westward across the plains of America. Then it's cool. But I just want you to understand something from the point of view of the settlers for a second. And I'm not a settler. And I'm not a huge fan of many dimensions of the settler project, so don't misread me based on what I'm about to say. Again, I want to try to understand the other side. They say to their grandparents, when Israel got the borders from the UN in 1947, they were really lousy borders. And that's why in the Declaration of Independence, when earlier drafts said, and we hereby commit ourselves to the borders outlined by the United Nations, Resolution 181, later drafts cut that out. Because Ben-Gurion said, either we're going to get killed or we're going to win. And if we win, we're obviously going to increase our size because these borders are indefensible. And say these settlers to their grandparents, you won in 48 and 49. And all the land that you captured in that war, you kept. And you built on it. And today it's called the Galilee. And nobody's having a conversation about whether or not Carmiel should go back to, I don't know, Jordan or whoever. Well, it wasn't anything. It was Ottoman, and then it was Israeli. But they say to their grandparents, why do you think what we're doing is radical? We're doing exactly what you did. Is Zionism either bought land in the early days or captured land in defensive wars that it did not start and did not want, and then built on it? You did it, and it's called the Galilee. We do it, and it's called occupied territories. Why? Now, again, I understand why. It's not the same situation. It's complicated, but from their point of view. Now, the people that moved to Gaza not because there was a Galleria there, right? I mean, I'm learning a little bit about Houston, right? There's also a Galleria in LA, so don't be so proud of yourselves. But in any event, they didn't move to Gaza because it was easy. They moved to Gaza because that's what they thought Zionism ideology was all about. You capture land, you build on it. And I took my kids to Gaza about 4 weeks before the disengagement. They were teenagers. My daughter was about to go in the army. She's the oldest. I wanted them to see what was about to get bulldozed. We're not talking about caravans. Talking about synagogues like the size of this room, which in Israel is huge, and homes with front yards and backyards and little shopping malls and cemeteries where people who, when they got kicked out, had to disinter the children that they'd buried and had to disinter the parents that they'd buried. It was a real community. We think settlers, we think of a 16-year-old with a light bulb and a gun, but that's not what this was. This was suburbia. Now, what has this got to do with this? It has the following to Yoel Ben Nun writes in this article about 3 weeks ago, and he said, why do I hate the Supreme Court? I hate is too strong a word, but dislike intently the Supreme Court. He said, because in 2005, when Ariel Sharon wanted to pull the 8,000 Jews out of Gaza, many people petitioned the Supreme Court on all kinds of issues related to it, and the Supreme Court heard none of the cases. He said, but there's 3 houses in Sheikh Jarrah that Palestinian families claim to own from before the War of Independence and then recaptured in 1967. You've heard about it because that's the one in Jerusalem that always makes the front page of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and whatever else. He said, there's three families. And it eats up tons of oxygen of the Supreme Court. Why is the Supreme Court more inclined to worry about 3 Palestinian families than 8,000 good, wholesome Israeli Jews who thought they were just doing what Zionism had called upon subsequent generations to do? Again, I'm not arguing we shouldn't have gotten out of Gaza. I'm definitely but this is about the Supreme Court. Now, basically, the Supreme Court, the reform is based on 4 things, real quick. Number 1, changing the nature, the composition of the committee that picks the judges, which is now controlled more or less by the present judges and the Bar Association. And the proposal is to give all the power to the Knesset, essentially, but something in the middle is probably right. To do away with judicial review, to change what's called the reasonability clause, doesn't matter what it is right now, and to change the legal authority of sub-attorney generals in the various ministries, also very technical, we won't go into it. The 1990s Israeli Supreme Court under Aharon Barak was a very, very, very activist Supreme Court. And so a lot of people there's probably a lot of people you know here who are not inclined to an activist Supreme Court, say the court has to be roped in for a variety of reasons. So basically, most people in Israel think that actually some judicial reform is really in order. But sometimes the fix can be worse than the problem. And this is one of those cases where people worry. If the government, the sitting government, which by the way in the Knesset combines the executive and the legislative already, and it's a unicameral, not bicameral parliament. There's no House and Senate, no House of Commons, House of Lords. It's one house which combines the legislative and the executive, and you also now give it the power to choose the judges and defang judicial review, everybody says, or a lot of people say, that's not a democracy because there's no checks and balances. And if the Supreme Court or the Knesset, and this is not unthinkable, the Knesset were to say in 3 months, if this goes through, we're closing all the Reform synagogues in Israel. We're not big fans. Now, if that happens today, it goes to the Supreme Court in a second, and the Supreme Court says, no, you're not. End of discussion. But what if there is no Supreme Court? Now, the people that are pushing the judicial reform say, no, you're making a big deal out of nothing. Because if the next Knesset doesn't reinstate, right, or validate that law again, then the law falls off. But that's in 4 years. And how many Israelis are going to go to the polls in 4 years, and their number one priority is going to be that ruling about reform synagogues? Or are they going to maybe care a little bit more about Iran and security and economics and so forth? So this is a very, very big danger to Israeli democracy, which is why hundreds of thousands of us are out there protesting. And the ultimate goal, I think, is to have a national conversation with level-headed people, which means we have to import them, but okay, right? With level-headed people, talk about what kind of judicial reform do we actually genuinely need, and how can we get it through in a way that nobody feels they got bashed on the head with a baseball bat? Because what the government's doing now is so fast and furious that it almost doesn't matter even what the content of the proposal is. People feel that it's being forced down their throats. But as we know, Bibi's in a tight spot. And
Right. Thank you. Thank you. David, I think you have some questions. And while David's bringing them over, your book was just distributed, published a few weeks ago. And I think...
a week ago. Don't make it older than it is.
Well, Amazon got it to me pretty quickly. So I'm glad that I've been able to read it.
They have those boxes at the ready, you know,
Right.
Amazon. They're great.
Absolutely. In your book, I read, and apropos of this existential issue, that in 1492 you cited Bravanel, who was the leader of the Spanish Jewish community, and he wrote a few months before the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, "The situation of Spanish Jewry has never been better." So the fact is that we can be as pie-eyed as we care to be and optimistic as we want to be, but really I wonder, have we lost the ability to spot danger in times that we're experiencing now in Israel? Are we being as careful to examine what's going on? Is it the issue? Is there something that we're missing? And especially from your point of view, to those of us who read the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, we might read some of the press from Israel. What are we missing in the headlines in the story that might cause us to believe something that isn't really going to be? About there.
First of all, I want to commend to your reading something by the old Bibi Netanyahu, like about a year and a bit ago. He was in an interview with Gadi Taub. Gadi Taub is one of Israel's leading journalists. They did a phenomenal podcast together, and then it was translated into English by Mosaic Magazine, which is excellent. And Bibi's the son of a world-class Jewish historian, and Bibi is a voracious reader. You'll be very hard-pressed to find a picture of Bibi Netanyahu on a plane without a book. Seriously. Like, the minute he gets on that plane, he's reading. He's brilliant. And he's very knowledgeable. And in this interview with Gadi Taub, he said, but the current Jewish world, well, he starts with talking about it in Europe until the present day, he says, has lost its sixth sense for smelling danger. So Abarbanel says in 14, right? But also, and how many people didn't leave Germany? By the way, that's why, complicated. You hear on Yom HaShoah last week that a third of the Holocaust survivors in Israel live under the poverty line. Now, there is zero excuse for that. 0.00, so don't misinterpret what I'm about to say. But Israel's always had a very fraught relationship with the Holocaust survivors who came to Israel. Because they say, the fathers of Zionism told you 50 years before that to get out. Jabotinsky told you to get out. And Herzl told you to get out. Everybody said to get out. You didn't get out. Now, doesn't justify that they live under the poverty line, but the feelings are very complicated. They're trying to build a new Jew and in-straggle these victims with numbers tattooed on their arm. Very complicated. So Bibi says we've lost the ability to smell danger. I don't think Israelis have lost the ability to smell danger yet. But what I think we were afraid we might have lost was the passion for the project. And I think we haven't lost the passion for the project. So I am actually, again, I would startle my children. I'm very optimistic that if we can get through the next 8 weeks, we can get through the next decade or two. But we have to have some really serious leadership, and we have to have some serious conversations over the course of those next decades. But it's about my own son, real quick. He's 33. He's married to a phenomenal woman. He's a lawyer. He clerked at the Supreme Court. They've got one kid. They got a kid on the way. He was a commando for 8 years. He was, of course, running a high-tech company now because he's Israeli, right? I mean, he's had a really interesting life. And the night that Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, got fired by Bibi, and there were these spontaneous eruptions of protests, not the ones that you get WhatsApp saying, meet here at 8 o'clock, meet there at 9 o'clock, whatever. There was these spontaneous. He said they have a flag by the door. It's because that's your weapon of choice these days. So they have a gigantic flag on a pole by their front door. He said, I grabbed my flag and I went out into the streets of Tel Aviv, and he texted us because we had already come to the States. He texted my wife and me, and he said, I got back at 3 o'clock in the morning, took a shower, went to sleep for a couple hours, then I got to go to the office. He said it was by far the most meaningful night of my life. Something's happening. Yeah. And so I don't think there's a lot we don't know. We just need to understand how complex it is.
Right.
But I think there's not something burning that we just don't get.
I think it's encouraging for us to hear that passion, because there is the sense that there are so many generations growing up in Israel. It's a good problem, but many who never knew a world without Israel. So it's easy to take it for granted, but to hear your son respond in such a passionate way gives us hope that there is a passion for the project, as you call it. And I think that also leads us, there's a question in my pile that is somewhere in here, but I remember it, because I think it lends now to ask this same question: where is the passion in America for the same project, and where should it come from? What would be a good sign of passion from American Jews for Israel at this time?
That's a fabulous question also. Look, the reason I wrote this book, which it really doesn't matter if you read it as long as you buy it, but the reason I wrote this book was because what was frustrating me about the American Jewish conversation about Israel is that it starts with conflict and ends with non-Orthodox Judaism. Those are both huge moral issues that nobody who cares about the Jewish people or the Jewish state dare ignore. But they're not all that Israel is. And the conversation never gets up to 30,000 feet to what's the whole project about? And that's why in the book I wanted to ask, why did they found the state? We never talk about that. So look, what I would say is, what do we have to remember here and what we do here? When is America going to solve its race problem? Exactly. And when is America going to solve the gun problem? Okay. So that's the thing. But I don't see the young kids on campuses, the young Jewish kids on American campuses who are protesting against Israel at every step of the way because of the conflict and because of whatever else, having those kinds of feelings about America. And I'm glad that they don't. Because I think that being a patriot is like being a spouse or a parent or the child of an aging parent. It's complicated, and you buy into stuff and you sign up for stuff that you didn't want. You don't want to take care of your parents when they're really, really, really diminished, but you do because it's the right thing to do and you love the person that they were. And you don't want to be with your kid in the emergency room at 3 o'clock in the morning for some whatever. And we all married people who are wonderful and at certain moments are hard. Mostly because they know us better than anybody else in the world knows us, and they tell us what we need to hear. And that's hard, and it's painful, and that's what marriage is all about. And I understand that complex. Everybody buys that. Everybody buys the fact that you can love this country, be terribly frustrated by its gun problem, be terribly frustrated by its race problem, or there's a whole other list, right, obviously. But I'm an American, and it's an amazing country, and I feel proud to be part of this great democracy, flawed, great democracy. But Israel, oh my God, the pamphlet of Palestinians, I'm done. And that feels to me like an abandonment not of Israel, but an abandonment of the Jewish people. Because the state of Israel, this would be the other really critical point tonight, I think. You and I here in Houston, and American Jews all over, and Israeli Jews, we all tell the same story about the Jewish people. In Hebrew, we call it michurban lebinyan, from destruction to rebirth. That's the narrative of the Jewish people in the 20th and 21st century. That narrative only works if there is a Jewish state. People in Houston are animated by a Jewish people revived because of the Jewish state. Jews in America have a passion about a Jewish people newly energized because of a Hebrew language reborn, because of a Jewish state, because of people like Amos Oz and David Grossman, who are the finalists for the Man Booker International Prize, because of the Jewish state. And you see lots of Jewish content on Netflix, and most of it comes from the Jewish state. And you see a rebirth, an explosion of Jewish culture and Jewish pride, a lot of which, not all of which, but a lot of which comes from there. So it feels to me that what we really need to think about is when I'm willing to sever my ties or sever my love for or sever my association with Israel, but not with America. God forbid, I'm not encouraging anybody to sever it with America, God forbid. But why? Show me the country that's not wrestling with really, really huge moral problems. And imagine the Jewish people without that. I think it should lead people to say, through thick and thin, I'm with it. And I don't necessarily want to give my money blankets. I'm going to give my money to this. I'm going to give my money to that. I'm going to go to Israel and volunteer for the other thing. I'm going to be very specific. I'll be laser pointed sharp, but I want to still be part of the project. And that's what I think we have to encourage people to feel and to understand, that to dissociate yourself from the Jewish state is, at the end of the day, to dissociate yourself in a meaningful way from the future of the Jewish people.
Thank you for putting it in those terms. I think it really helps us to understand. We struggle here with students on campus, the far progressive left, who have abandoned the state of Israel, but it shouldn't come at the expense of the abandonment of the Jewish people, and we need the state of Israel if there's going to be a Jewish people in the future. It brings me back also because we were talking about Bibi, not an easy topic either, but there were those who voted for Bibi for all the reasons that he was in power, security, Iran, all those issues brought the people to the polls and to vote for him. But now the question becomes, as we see another side of him, what distinguishes Netanyahu from other strong men, quote unquote, throughout history?
That's a hard and painful question. It depends on how this plays out. There's a really interesting question in Israel. Does he really care at all about the country anymore? I mean, people talk about that. People really talk about that. By the way, we never, ever, 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 and I mean never, ever, 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 talk about the Palestinian conflict. Ever. Because we don't know it's there, because we don't think it's a problem, because we don't have any moral part to ourselves. We just don't know what to do about it. So every now and then there was a little flare-up, we talk about it. But it's not, we're stuck with it. We hate it, we wish it was different, but it's been a lot of Shabbases since I've been at a Shabbos dinner when anybody's talked about that. But at a lot of Shabbos dinners in the last few months, does he care? Does he even care about this country? Or is he just so determined to stay out of jail that he's willing to pull the whole project down with him? Now, part of me just can't believe that that's true. And then especially that same son says, Abba, you got to kind of get a grip, because he doesn't care. Now, I don't know. I don't know. You know, he doesn't consult with me often. So I don't know. But look, is he like other strong men? Here's a piece of what's going on in Israel that you'd have no way of knowing about, because it's directed only at Israelis and it's only on our social media. But I'm not making this up, we're getting little video clips from Poland and Hungary and their activists. And they say in English, their Hebrew's not great, they say in English, we're here to tell you, keep protesting. They want to wear you down. They wore us down, and then before we knew it, they had changed the Supreme Court, and then before we knew it, they had changed the laws, and now we're not a liberal democracy anymore. So we're telling you, if you want to know what can happen, look at 3 countries, Poland, Hungary, and Turkey, and then get out and protest. It's unbelievably moving. I mean, these Christian people in Poland with their Polish accents in English saying to you, Israelis, we're very encouraged by watching what you're doing and we're very inspired, but don't give up. So that's really kind of cool, but it also means he's not all that different from Erdogan or Orban or whatever. So I don't really understand Bibi, I have to say. I don't understand them. And it's hard for me to believe that Bibi wants Israel to become Poland or Hungary. I really kind of can't believe that, but I don't have any good evidence to the contrary.
Yeah. Well, I think it's difficult for us to understand it too, although we've had sort of our own analog in the United States.
Except my analogs read a lot more books.
Right, right. Yeah, a question related to the topic. The question is, my mother used to ask, is this good or bad for the Jews? If the Israeli cabinet succeeds in its plan to change the law of return, how will this impact American Jews' ability to seek refuge if ever they must flee the U.S.?
So it was really great tonight, and I just want to thank you again. No, I'm going to say something now. I'm really a nice guy. Really, I'm a nice guy. But I understand how offensive this potential change to the law of return is, but I want to say three things about it. Number one, it is not directed at American Jews. It has nothing to do, in the eyes of the people who are talking about changing the law, to do with American Jews, and it has everything to do with Ukrainian and Russian Jews, who are coming by the thousands, the tens of thousands, getting passports, getting citizenship, getting some of the financial whatevers that come with that, and going right back to the Ukraine and Russia, knowing that they have the passport in hand, so that if they really, I don't understand how bad it would have to get to think you have to get out, but nonetheless, they're going back there right now. They have families and stuff. I understand it's not simple, and Israelis are very worried that these people are overwhelmingly not halakhically Jewish. The ones who really cared about being part of the Jewish people's rebirth in its ancient homeland came 20, 30 years ago. These are the people that are just fleeing a war, and we should probably let them in on humanitarian grounds, but not on law of return grounds, say these people, because they're not Jewish. And if you want Israel to not have an intermarriage issue, then part of what you have to do, besides education and identity and all of that, is the demographics have to match. And so these are people that are saying, what we know they're not Jewish, we know they didn't care about Israel before, so we want to let them in on humanitarian grounds for X number of years, great, but the law of return should be cut back from what it was. It was originally just a Jewish mother, then it became one Jewish grandparent. Now they want to restore it to the language of the law of return in the early 1950s. It's not directed at American Jews. That's the first thing. Just sometimes we assume that something is aimed at us, and it's not. And it's not about anything about Reform Judaism or conservative Judaism or anything like that. It's about Israeli demographics and a pile of passports that are now going to the Ukraine and Russia, which people are very uncomfortable with. Now, having said that, say two things. Number one, three quickies. I'll never forget the moment. It was in Toronto. I feel comfortable saying that. It was at a group of people, the leadership of Toronto, a federation event, and a woman who was a Reform convert, who I assure you has exactly 0.000% intent of living in Israel, and that's rounding it up, okay, started to talk to me about how her Judaism isn't recognized by the chief rabbinate. And she started to cry. And it touched me. I can picture her now. It's got to be 15 years. It touched me so deeply because logically, what do you care? These guys with the black hats and the beards, you live in Toronto. They're never coming here. You're never moving there. What do you care? But she cares. And I understand that in a deep, deep way. It matters to people a lot. That's number one. Number two, statistically, the number of people in the United States who are converted in the Reform world or the conservative world, we're the same as far as they're concerned, right? Or their children, who want to make Aliyah per every 5 years is probably less than the number of people in this room. I mean, it's statistically zero. So it's a principled issue, but there's really nobody whose life is really being affected by that. I mean, there's literally a handful every couple of years. And the third thing that I would say, again, I understand why it's so painful. The general issue, this particular change of the law of return, I don't think is directed at your people, Reform community, my people, the conservative community. It's not, but I understand how painful it is. And here's the last thing I'll say about I really still do believe in Israel's goodness. I really do. Israel has more nonprofits per capita than any country on the planet. We could take all night long. I could just start telling you about people that I've interviewed on my podcast who do this unbelievable work. I mean, it's unbelievable. There's not a chance in the world that if God forbid, something happened here and Jews had to flee, that there's going to be somebody at the Ben Gurion airport asking, how did you convert? There's just not a chance that's going to happen. In other words, there's a certain way in which the Jewish state is there for the Jewish people. And there's lots of people, by the way, who have been given citizenship as they count for the Ministry of the Interior and they don't count for the Ministry of Religion. And who cares? If you get in, you get citizenship, you have a place to go. So I don't think there's ever going to be a Jew who's not going to have a place to go because of the Orthodox rabbinate's attitude towards non-Orthodox Judaism. And I'm not saying that as a non-Orthodox rabbi.
Yeah. And despite every claim, your children, I would need to send them a note because you are more optimistic than you let on.
Yeah, they'll say he's like Bibi. Something's really wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned demographics, so let me get to this question. What can be done to foster greater connection and understanding between Arabs and Jews in Israel in the future? And the question, I think, requires an explanation. Why is that question important, and what's really at the heart of it? Israeli Arabs or Palestinian Arabs? Who asked the question? Maybe you can address a little bit of both.
I don't know, what am I looking at? Oh, a microphone. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Okay.
So, Israeli Arabs and Palestinians. Okay. Where should we start?
Let's begin with the Israeli Arabs.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Israeli Arabs, first of all, the story's not nearly as bad as people think it is. I mean, not nearly as bad. It's much better to be an Israeli Arab than an African American in huge parts of this country. Much, 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 much better. When was the last time you saw an Israeli Arab get shot by a cop? You can't think of the example. Now, there's a huge murder problem inside the Israeli Arab community. It's Arab on Arab violence, and we've been unable to fix it. So I'm not saying it's all sugar and spice and all things. It's not. But nonetheless, the problem is not nearly as bad as one would say, and it's getting better all the time. Now, here again, I want to complicate things. How did the Israeli War of Independence start? Who was it between? It was between the Jews of Palestine and the Arabs of Palestine. The ones who fled are now Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, or Gaza. The ones who stayed fought and lost and are Israeli Arabs. Meaning, we're not talking 1776. We're talking in the lifetime of some of the people in this room. They were at war with us. In other words, it's just, so there are people walking around the street who can say, honestly, your grandfather killed my grandfather in either direction. Israeli Arab, Israeli Jew, it doesn't make any difference. So it started as a civil war. And we're done a lot better than Reconstruction did, right? I mean, we're doing a lot better, but there's a long way to go. And by the way, now you can understand why did Israeli Arabs, mostly young ones, but why did Israeli Arabs go bonkers in May 2021 when we were at war with Gaza and some horrible things happened in both sides? Jews did horrible things, Arabs did horrible things. There was really kind of violent rioting in Israel. Why did they do that? Because it's not, when I say, my Jewish cousins in the Soviet Union, I don't have any cousins in the Soviet Union. They're my Jewish brothers and sisters. They're Jews, so they're my brothers and my sisters when I get into a poetic mood. They are their cousins, not their figurative cousins. They're their cousins. And now, increasingly with tech, they're in touch every day. Sending pictures, happy birthdays. They can't cross the border. So how do you feel when your country is at war with your family? Now, if you're 40 or 50, you say it's really painful and you stay at home and you hope it gets better. But if you're 18 or you're 25, you go to the streets. Not everybody, but some. I just want to understand, again, I'm not justifying what they did. It was horrible and it was not okay, and people were killed on both sides, but I understand their anger and I understand their sense of profound discomfort. So look, I think the Israeli-Arab thing is very, very complicated, but it's not as complicated as we make it out to be. It's an underclass that has complete, full legal protection. The Supreme Court rules in their favor. By the way, that's another issue, but on all sorts of cases. But it's like any underclass. It's going to take time. They are, I mean, unfortunately, my wife had a very bad medical year last year. Thank God she's totally 1,000% fine. But I can't tell you the number of Arab doctors. I'm not talking nurses, not talking technicians who are also Arab and amazing human beings. Tell you 2 quick stories just to bring Israel to life. So we're in the hospital for many days. My wife had a whole bunch of roommates. Some of them were Arab, some of them were Israeli Jews, and some of them were Haredi. People in the hospital are sick. Some of them are older, some of them are less aware. One day an Arab nurse comes in. She closes the curtain, obviously, and she's going to give the Haredi woman who's in my wife's room like a sponge bath. Totally appropriate. And it was a Friday, like at 10 o'clock in the morning. And the woman said, no, I can't wash, it's Shabbat. And the Arab nurse says, oh no, it's not Shabbat. Candle lighting is not till 6:28. And I thought, oh my God. And then I was, staying there lots of days, and a lot of nights I slept over in the hospital. And, so I had my tallis and my tefillin with me, and in the morning I would walk down to the end of the hallway where there's this little family waiting room, and it's Hadassah Ein Karem. There's nothing's perpendicular to anything. I have no idea where you are, and your iPhone's compass doesn't work. I have no idea where I'm supposed to be facing. So I sort of roughly gauge, I think the old city's in that direction. So I start to daven, I'm doing my thing, minding my own business. All of a sudden I feel these 2 ginormous hands on my shoulders and an Arabic voice saying to me in perfectly good Hebrew, saying, no, what are you doing? You're praying towards Mecca. The old city's that way, right? And he like moved me. Like, I don't really care that much, to tell you the truth. I figure if God wants to hear my prayers, he or she can go find them somewhere. But my point is that there's these moments where you just see how, it's actually getting much better. It's an underclass. It really is, but it's not. There's a huge amount of progress there. Now, the Palestinian side is much more complicated because the Palestinian leadership, at the very least, is undeniably at war with the state of Israel and intent on destroying the state of Israel. It's not PC. It just happens to be the truth. In other words, as my grandmother used to say, das ist nicht nur MS, das ist Effekt, right? It's just true. So, by the way, a majority of Israeli Jews and a majority of Palestinians no longer support a 2-state solution. That's very bad. They don't. And so that's why I say when we don't talk about it because we feel stuck, but we just don't know what to do. And most of the time, it's fairly quiet. Right now, it's not so quiet. I don't know if that's because they sense weakness in the government. That's what some people are saying. 75th anniversary, Ramadan. It's really hard to know. It's been bad the last few weeks. Not horrible bad, but bad. Most of the times it's not. They live a horrible life that I wish they didn't live. And a checkpoint is a demeaning, humiliating thing to have to go to every day. But if we could figure out a better way for them not to bring arms into Israel when they are coming into work, we would do it. But the same way that you get into an airport is how they get into Israel. It's terrible, but it's just the reality.
Thank you. I think one of the takeaways from that, the comments about the Arabs and Israelis, is that we cannot simply catastrophize everything that we read about or imagine about the relationship between Arabs and Israeli Jews. Those stories, as you tell, are sweet, and they take off some of the harshness that we imagine because we deal with a lot of different diversities in our country too. And Houston, we claim, is the most diverse city in the country. And it is, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't set up certain boundaries. And we have gated neighborhoods with gated driveways, within the same gated neighborhood. So
And gated synagogues.
and gated synagogues. That's
No,
right.
with a lot of security that we never had when I lived in America.
Absolutely. We're reaching the end of our time tonight, and the questions have been wonderful. And you must purchase Rabbi Gordis's book. I'm not getting a commission. I'm just letting you know that. Yeah, I'm just letting you know that I've already read a large part of it since it arrived, and it's really quite important to read because of the history, but the way you contextualize it also is so helpful to us, because the title of the book, Impossible Takes Longer, is really, it's a paradox. And it raises the question about our hopefulness for Israel, but we're really dreaming about something that's impossible, and it's just going to take a lot longer to reach the impossible, which is such a strange thing to say, but it's a very Jewish thing to say as well. And I'm curious, you must have had to reach quite quickly your publisher's deadline, even as all of this that we're reading about is unfolding. If there were anything that you wanted to add to the book, what would you have wanted to add to be sure that it was encapsulated between the front and the back covers?
Yeah, that chapter on democracy might read differently. I mean, I do point to the dangers of democracy. The book was finished a year ago, Pesach. I finished it in Pesach, and then this summer, the past summer, I spent some time, sort of just fiddling with words here and there. So when this whole thing happened, remember the ancient times when we were worried about Ben Gvir, Smotrich, and Maoz? That was the big worry. Those were the good days. Remember that? There were just 3 reprehensible human beings who had been let into the government, but that was it. So then I said to the publisher, you gotta let me write an afterword. So they gave me 600 words. Okay, that's really nice of you. So anyway, I gave 600 words and I wrote about that. But here's what I said, and I think it still applies to this, even though obviously if I could rewrite it now, I would rewrite it about this too. I talk about a period in which, right after Andrew Jackson was elected president, okay? After Andrew Jackson was elected president, there was I forget who they were, but there was one congressman, I don't even have to say, or congresswoman, because Andrew Jackson was president, who said, the republic is destroyed beyond repair. And the other one, a congressman or senator, I forget who it was, said, the Constitution lies in tatters at his feet. Now, America was about to go to war to save the Constitution. And my point was, countries that believe in themselves have the capacity to transcend even really, really difficult periods. And so I am really very worried. I don't want my optimism to sound Pollyanna-ish. I'm very scared. I'm scared. And David Stav, whom some of you may know who he is, he was a candidate for the chief rabbinate a few years ago, but he didn't win because he's far too moderate and decent and all that. But he came to my office about, 8 weeks ago for a conversation. His office told him he had to come to have this conversation. It doesn't matter what the subject was. But he didn't really know who the hell I was, and why should he? And he was trying to figure it out, like very quickly. So if he had a briefing paper, that would have been nice, but he didn't have a briefing paper, and he probably doesn't know how to, use the phone that well. So he just decided to kind of tease out. He said to me, how are you feeling these days? Meaning, whatever I said about that was going to tell him a lot about where I am on Israel stuff. Here's what I told him, and I'll share it with you because it's the opposite side of the scale with the optimism thing. So here's what I said to Rabbi Stav, who's an extraordinary human being. I said, when my dad died 7.5 years ago, the best seconds of the day were the first seconds of the day. Because I woke up, sun was streaming, my wife was sleeping right there, and then I remembered. Then the rest of the day was horrible. I said to him, I don't even have those seconds now. I dream about it. And I wake up in the middle of the night from it. I literally wake up in the middle of the night with something. And when I find myself waking up at like some sort of quasi-normal time in the morning, I'm already in the middle of a thought. There aren't those seconds. And I've had more than one occasion when I'm walking down the hall at work and I just see a student and I say to her, "Hi, how you doing?" And she bursts into tears. She says, "I can't sleep." Everybody I know can't sleep. I have no idea what the consumption, this is not a joke. I have no idea what the consumption of sedatives and sleeping pills in Israel is these days. I guarantee you it's skyrocketed. Nobody can sleep that I know. We're really worried. And I'm saying, I think the next 2 months, 3 months, I don't know. It could be really, really nasty. And if you're the police, you cannot safeguard 200,000 people in Tel Aviv every Saturday night. You can't protect them all. And it will take only one crazy person on either side to do something terrible. The last time Israel had rhetoric like this that we have now, we buried Yitzhak Rabin. So I don't want my optimism about the long run to do a disservice to the profundity of the existential crisis in which we find ourselves. What gives me optimism is those hundreds of thousands of mostly young people out there who, God forbid, even if there were violence, that would just bring more of them out. And they're not going to stop because of what they're being told by Hungary and Poland, and they get it. They're smart. They're not going to stop until something's happened that's going to protect Israel's democracy for the long run, as long as we possibly can. That said, two things. Number one, the interim could be very unpretty. And number two, unless we can create a cultural and intellectual dialogue with the Mizrahim, then the demographic tick-tock clock is ticking against us. Because eventually, it'll get through. So we need to have a really important conversation. We don't need a constitution. A constitution would be a nice thing, maybe, but we need a constitutional convention. Right. And I mean that seriously. It doesn't matter if the document comes out. We need to have the conversation. We don't have to go to Philadelphia, but we have to have the conversation. Ironically, sadly, tragically, one of the things that would actually jet propulsion the conversation towards happening would be violence. That would scare people even more, and I don't want to go there. So I am very optimistic, and as I'm very in love with this project called the Jewish State. I feel very blessed to live there. I think my children have had an unbelievable experience growing up there that was very different than they would have had almost anywhere else in the world. By the way, being drafted makes you a better person. It does, because it's not all about you. What high school you're going to, what college you're going to, what graduate school you're going to, what postdoc you're getting. It's about, right now, it's not about you. It's about the country. It's bigger than you, and you owe it, because it gives you health care, and it gives you food, and it gives you electricity, and you owe the country. And taking 3 years in my daughter's case, 2 years in one other kid's case, and 8 years in that other son's case, it's an important message, give back to your country in a very significant way. So I'm very optimistic about it. I feel very blessed and very privileged that my wife made me move there. That's actually true, but another story for another time. And I'm very, very scared, very frightened, very worried, and very optimistic all at the same time.
Daniel, first, yes. You speak like a good Israeli and a good American, optimistic and terribly frightened and concerned. And I think we've learned from you that we can do both at the same time, because we also believe in the Jewish project of Israel and certainly in the Jewish people. In this congregation, in this Jewish community, I think you will at least be able to go home and say, I met some Jews in Houston and Jewish allies who believe in the Jewish project in the land of Israel. And as I shared with Daniel earlier, the long history of this particular congregation that was an anti-Zionist congregation. You'll have to read about the history if you don't know it. But I'm so proud, so grateful that this congregation has followed me and Joan and Stanford Alexander, who support us in much of this work, to be sure that we are at the table participating in the project of the Jewish state so that we can get up at night, and we can have our nightmares too with you, but be sure that at the end of the day, we're all standing in the right place where we should be so that we can celebrate, God willing, in 75 years, another Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day.
Amen.
Join us for the rest of the weekend. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Daniel.